The subject, Liam Sterling, operated under the professional designation of an investigative journalist, though a more accurate classification would be that of a modern folklorist. His medium was the podcast, a platform he leveraged with considerable success under the title Phantoms and Frequencies. The premise of his work was the critical examination of paranormal claims through the lens of audio engineering. He was not a believer in the supernatural. Rather, he was a connoisseur of the anomalies that human perception and faulty equipment could generate. His quest was for the perfect, unexplainable recording, a piece of data that would defy logical decomposition. This quest had led him to Blackwood Studios. The edifice itself was a relic, a brick-and-mortar ghost from an era when music was captured on magnetic tape and budgets were astronomical. Located in a forgotten industrial sector, its facade was stained with the city's grime, its windows boarded over like cataracts on the eyes of the dead. The studio had ceased commercial operations decades ago, following a string of unfortunate events that had curdled its reputation. Financial ruin was the official cause, but the folklore, the data Liam was truly interested in, spoke of something else. It spoke of suicides, tragic accidents, and a pervasive creative malaise that seemed to seep from the very walls. At the heart of this folklore was a specific location within the building, Studio C, colloquially known as the Echo Room. Liam was met at the rusted gate by the studio's sole custodian, a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur was as much a part of the building as the decaying insulation and the ghost-ridden mixing boards. His posture was stooped, a human architecture mirroring the building's slow collapse. He moved with a shuffling gait that produced no sound, a skill likely honed over years of walking the silent, dust-choked halls. "You're the podcaster," Arthur stated, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was not a question. "Liam Sterling," Liam confirmed, extending a hand that Arthur regarded for a moment before giving it a brief skeletal shake. "Thank you for letting me in. I've sent the payment for the night. The money is on the desk." "It'll be there in the morning," Arthur said, his words carrying an implicit assumption about Liam's departure. He turned and led the way, a single key unlocking a heavy, groaning door. The air that escaped from within was cool and stagnant, carrying the distinct olfactory signature of decaying paper, ozone from old electronics, and something else, an underlying, faintly metallic scent, like old blood or rust. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors lined with faded gold records and promotional photographs of musicians whose smiles seemed unnervingly frozen. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights, a silent, swirling cosmos. Arthur led Liam past Studio A, the grand hall where orchestras once played, and Studio B, a more intimate space for rock bands, until they reached a final, unmarked door at the end of a long hallway. The door was different from the others. It was thicker, clad in a sheet of what looked like steel, and featured a heavy, wheel-like handle reminiscent of a submarine hatch. "Studio C," Arthur announced unnecessarily, built by Silas Blackwood himself, the founder. He was obsessed with sonic purity, an acoustic perfectionist. Liam ran a hand over the cold steel. "The legend says it's soundproof." Arthur's lips formed a thin, mirthless line. "It is. And it isn't. It doesn't let sound out. It doesn't let sound in. But the sounds that are made inside, they don't always leave." He looked at Liam, his eyes clouded with a familiar pity he reserved for people like him. Blackwood wanted a room with zero acoustic reflection, a true anechoic chamber. He used 3 layers of brick, a foot of concrete, lead lining to block radio waves, and then the interior walls were mounted on springs decoupled from the main structure. Inside, it's all cork and fiberglass wedges. In theory, the only thing you should hear in there is the blood pumping in your ears and the sound of your own nervous system. "And in practice?" Liam prompted, already unshouldering his heavy Pelican case of equipment. "In practice," Arthur sighed. "Silas Blackwood was the first to die in it. An aneurysm, they said, found him slumped over the console. His last words, according to his notes, were a complaint that he could hear a persistent echo that he couldn't eliminate." Liam's interest was piqued. This was the core of the myth. The Echo Room did not reflect sound. It was said to absorb it, to record it into its very structure, and under specific, unknown conditions, it played the recordings back. Specifically, it was said to have captured the final, emotionally charged utterances of every person who had died within its walls. Arthur turned the heavy wheel, the mechanism groaning in protest. With a final, resonant thud, the pressure seal broke, and he pulled the heavy door open. The immediate effect was jarring. The ambient hum of the building, the faint traffic noise, even the sound of their own breathing seemed to be instantly vacuumed into the black, silent maw of the doorway. The air inside felt thick, heavy, and dead. The interior was an unsettling geometric landscape. The floor, ceiling, and walls were all covered in large foam-like wedges, their sharp angles pointing into the room, designed to trap and dissipate any sound wave. A single bare bulb hung from a cable, casting stark, angular shadows. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair and a small, functional-looking mixing desk with an old reel-to-reel tape machine on it. It was a space designed to systematically starve the senses. Liam stepped inside, and the change was profound. It felt as if cotton had been packed into his ears. His own footsteps on the grated metal floor were dull, lifeless thuds, devoid of any echo or reverberation. He could feel a low-frequency pressure in his sinuses. It was a deeply unnatural environment. "The equipment you're bringing in," Arthur said, his voice sounding strangely thin and close, as if he were whispering directly into Liam's ear. "It might not behave the way you expect. The room, it affects things. I've accounted for the RF shielding and the lack of ambient noise," Liam said, his professionalism a shield against the creeping unease. "My gear is top of the line." "It's not the shielding I'm talking about," Arthur said cryptically. He pointed to the reel-to-reel machine. "That one hasn't worked in 30 years, but sometimes when it's quiet, you can see the reels trying to turn." Liam set his case down and began to unpack with meticulous efficiency. His apparatus was chosen for its sensitivity and clarity. He deployed a pair of Neumann U87 condenser microphones, positioning them in a stereo configuration to capture the full breadth of the room. These fed into a Sound Devices Mix Pre 6.2, a field recorder known for its exceptionally clean preamps and precise timecode. For control, he had a laptop and a set of high-fidelity closed-back headphones. He was not here to capture ghostly whispers. He was here to capture high-resolution audio data, whatever its source. "The rules are simple," Arthur said from the doorway, his form silhouetted against the dim light of the hall. "I lock this outer door. No one else is in the building. You have a walkie-talkie. It works most of the time. If you need to leave, you call me. Don't try the door yourself. The pressure difference can make it stick. I'll be back at 6 a.m. "Understood?" Liam replied, his focus already on calibrating his microphone levels. "One last thing," Arthur added, his voice dropping lower. "The room, it gets lonely. It likes new sounds. Try not to give it anything you're not prepared to hear again." Before Liam could process the strange warning, Arthur pulled the heavy steel door shut. The wheel lock turned with a series of final, tomb-like clicks. The single bare bulb in the room flickered once, then held steady. The silence that descended was absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight on his eardrums. Liam put on his headphones, turned up the gain on his recorder, and listened. As Arthur had predicted, the primary sound was Liam's own biology. The rhythmic, low-frequency pump of his heart. The faint, high-pitched hiss of his own nervous system. The sound of his jacket rustling was like a forest fire. The sound of his own swallowing was a wet, cavernous gulp. For the first hour, this was the entirety of the data he collected. He sat in the chair, perfectly still, his breathing controlled, letting the recorder run. He was establishing a baseline, a control sample of the room's utter silence. He documented his initial findings in a hushed voice, his own words sounding alien and intrusive in the dead space. Timestamp 21:37. Subject is Liam Sterling. Location Studio C, Blackwood Studios. Ambient noise floor is effectively 0, reading at 130 dBFS on the recorder. Primary audio phenomena are biological. No external contamination detected. The psychological effects of the anechoic environment are already notable. A mild sense of disorientation, an urge to produce sound to confirm one's own presence. He fell silent again, letting another 30 minutes pass. He checked his laptop, monitoring the scrolling waveform display. It was a flat line, punctuated only by the tiny, regular peaks of his own heartbeat picked up by the sensitive microphones. It was exactly what he expected. It was perfectly, scientifically boring. And then, he saw it. On the screen, a new signal began to form. It was not a sudden spike, but a slow, gradual rise in the noise floor. A faint, almost subliminal waveform appeared. It was too low to be audible over the sound of his own body, but it was undeniably there. He held his breath, listening intently through his headphones, pushing the gain to its maximum safe level. And then he heard it. It was not a voice. Not yet. It was a soft, sibilant whisper, like the sound of sand trickling down a slope. It had no discernible words, but it had a cadence, a rhythm, like the ghost of a sentence. It lasted for approximately 4.7 seconds, and then faded back into the profound silence. Liam's heart was now a drum in his ears, its waveform clearly visible on his monitor. He rewound the recording, his hands moving with practiced speed. He isolated the anomalous section and played it back. There it was. A clear, captured signal. It was not RF interference. The lead-lined walls made that impossible. It was not an external sound. The room was a sealed acoustic tomb. It was not his own biological noise. It was something else. An acoustic event originating from within the silent room. He ran a spectral analysis on the sound file. The frequency range was narrow, concentrated in the 2 to 4 kHz range, consistent with human speech, particularly sibilance. But it was faint, degraded, as if it had been recorded and re-recorded 1,000 times, each iteration losing a piece of its fidelity. He sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. The initial physiological response of fear was quickly being supplanted by a surge of professional exhilaration. This was not pareidolia. This was not a technical glitch. This was data. Clean, isolated, and utterly inexplicable. He leaned forward, speaking into the microphone again, his voice now charged with excitement. Timestamp 22:14. An anomalous acoustic event has been recorded. Duration, 4.7 seconds. Nature of sound is a low-amplitude, sibilant whisper. Analysis is ongoing, but initial findings suggest it is not artifactual. The experiment is proving successful. I am now attempting to prompt the phenomenon. He stood up and clapped his hands once. The sound was a flat, unsatisfying pop that was instantly swallowed by the foam wedges. There was no echo, no decay, just the sound, and then its immediate absence. He waited. The flat line on his monitor remained. He decided to try speech. "Hello?" he said, his voice loud in the dead space. "Is there anyone here? My name is Liam Sterling. I'm here to record." Silence. He waited for a full 5 minutes. Nothing. The room was inert once more. Perhaps the phenomenon was random, a product of atmospheric pressure changes or residual energy. He sat down, disappointed but still energized by his initial finding. He would wait. Patience was the most crucial tool in his kit. Another hour crawled by. The silence began to work on him again, the initial excitement giving way to a strange, hypnotic fatigue. His sense of space felt distorted. He felt both claustrophobic and agoraphobic, trapped in a tiny room that felt as vast and empty as deep space. It was as he was checking his battery levels that the second event occurred. This one was different. It was not a whisper. It was a word. A single, clearly enunciated word, spoken in a dry, academic-sounding male voice. The word emerged from the silence directly into his headphones with such clarity that Liam physically recoiled, ripping the headphones from his head as if they had burned him. He stared at the microphones, his chest tight. The room remained silent and still. Shaking, he slowly put the headphones back on and played back the last 30 seconds of the recording. First, the familiar hiss of his own nervous system, then the rustle of his jacket, and then the voice. It was clear, with no degradation. It sounded as if the speaker were standing right between the two microphones. The word it spoke was, "Listen." The scientific mind abhors a vacuum of explanation. For Liam Sterling, the word listen was not a supernatural command. It was a variable, a data point that had just catastrophically failed to conform to any known physical model. His first instinct was not fear, but a frantic, meticulous process of elimination. He tore the headphones off and scanned the room, his eyes darting into the deep, sound-absorbing corners. The single bulb illuminated only the oppressive geometry of the foam wedges. The room was empty. His gear was isolated. There was no speaker. He muted the live input and focused solely on the recording. On his laptop screen, the waveform of the word was a perfect, symmetrical structure. It was not a distant, ethereal whisper. It was a clean, dry, studio-quality vocal recording. He ran a spectral analysis. The voice was male, exhibiting the tonal characteristics of a subject in their late 50s or early 60s. The recording was devoid of any reverberation, as expected in an anechoic chamber. There was no background noise, no hiss from analog tape, no digital artifacting. It was, from a technical standpoint, a pristine signal, a signal from nowhere. This was a more profound violation of physics than the sibilant whisper. The whisper could, at the furthest stretch of speculative science, be explained away as some form of acoustic imprint, a residual energy pattern decaying over time. But this was different. This was high fidelity. It was coherent. It was an instruction. "Listen to what?" Liam whispered, the sound of his own voice a shocking intrusion. He immediately regretted speaking, remembering Arthur's warning. He looked at the recorder's input meters, watching the waveform of his own question get captured. He had just fed the room a new sample, a cold dread, distinct from his scientific curiosity, began to prickle at the back of his neck. He forced himself back to the problem at hand. The voice had belonged to Silas Blackwood, the studio's founder. He was certain of it. The dry academic tone matched the descriptions he'd read in old industry journals. Blackwood had died in this very room. Were these his final words? Listen? It seemed too simple, too mundane for a man's last utterance. Unless he was hearing something that had caused the aneurysm. Liam decided to follow the instruction. He recalibrated his entire methodology. He was no longer just a passive observer waiting for random events. He was now an active listener, hunting for a specific signal amidst the oppressive silence. He pushed the gain on his preamps to a level that would be considered dangerously high in any normal environment, making the sound of his own circulatory system an oceanic roar in his ears. He sat motionless in the chair, controlling his breathing, trying to make his own biology as quiet as possible. He was trying to listen underneath the sound of his own life. For 20 minutes, the only result was a growing sense of vertigo. The sensory deprivation, combined with the hyper-amplification of his own internal sounds, was profoundly disorienting. He felt detached from his body, as if he were a consciousness floating in a dark, pulsing void. He was on the verge of reducing the gain to preserve his sanity when a new sound began to emerge. It started at the very edge of the audible frequency spectrum, a low, melancholic hum. It was not a voice, but a single, sustained musical note. A cello, perhaps. The note held for a few seconds, then was joined by another, forming a mournful harmony. Liam's eyes were glued to his spectral analysis display. He could see the distinct frequencies appearing, perfect sine waves materializing out of the digital silence. Then a new voice entered the recording. This one was female. It was a fragile, breathy voice, laced with static and the distinct crackle of a phonograph needle. The voice began to sing a melody over the mournful notes. The song was fragmented, broken, as if being broadcast from a vast distance through a failing radio. The shadow of your smile, when you are gone. The voice was beautiful, but filled with an unmistakable sorrow. It wavered, then broke, replaced by a sharp, percussive sound, like a microphone being dropped. The music stopped. Then came a different sound, a wet, choked gasping, followed by a final, soft exhalation of air. Then silence. Utter, profound silence. Liam felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He frantically cross-referenced the file on his laptop containing his research on Blackwood Studios. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He searched for Death Studio C. The records were sparse, but he found it. In 1978, a decade after Blackwood's death, a promising young jazz singer named Eleanor Vance had booked Studio C for a private recording session. She was found the next morning, having taken her own life. The method was not specified in the public records. The song she was scheduled to record that night was a cover of The Shadow of Your Smile. The room was not just playing back final words, it was playing back final moments. The music, the dropped microphone, the final desperate breaths for air. It was an archive of death, a library of finalities. The implications were staggering. The room was a passive recording device of immense and unknown power. But the clarity of Blackwood's voice saying "listen" suggested something else. It suggested that a consciousness could persist, that it could choose to transmit a signal. Was Blackwood's ghost, for lack of a better term, acting as a curator for this horrific archive? Was he directing Liam's attention? As if in answer to his unasked question, the acoustic environment of the room began to break down. The silence was no longer a constant. It was now being punctured by a chaotic collage of sounds. A man screaming in frustration, "No, again!" from the top, followed by the sound of sheet music being crumpled. A soft, desperate weeping from the far corner of the room. The sharp, metallic scrape of a chair being dragged across the floor. A single echoing gunshot that, despite having no physical space to echo in, seemed to reverberate inside Liam's skull. The sharp, metallic scrape of a chair being dragged across the floor. A single echoing gunshot that, despite having no physical space to echo in, seemed to reverberate inside Liam's skull. The clean scientific experiment had devolved into a nightmare. Liam was no longer isolating individual phenomena. He was being bombarded. His recorder's display was a chaotic mess of overlapping waveforms. The voices were from different eras, their acoustic qualities telling a story of changing recording technology. Some were thin and tinny like old telephone calls. Others were rich and full, like modern digital recordings. All of them were ghosts in the machine. He tried to focus, to isolate one voice and ignore the others. He latched onto the angry producer's voice. Again, from the top. The voice was laced with the distortion of analog tape being pushed too hard. It repeated, over and over, a looped fragment of a long-dead man's frustration. Liam pulled up the studio's client history. He found a record of a notoriously difficult rock producer, Julian Croft, who had suffered a massive heart attack during a mixing session in 1985. The session notes indicated he had been struggling with a vocalist on a particular track. Liam was in a mausoleum of sound. Every death within these walls, whether by suicide, accident, or natural causes, had left an indelible acoustic scar. And for some reason tonight, the scars were all opening at once. He felt a new sensation, the distinct, unnerving feeling of being watched. He knew it was a classic psychological symptom of sensory deprivation, but the feeling was overwhelming. He kept glancing up from his laptop, expecting to see a figure standing amidst the foam wedges. The room was always empty, yet it felt increasingly crowded. He decided to run a control test. He needed to know if his equipment was, in some unknown way, stimulating this phenomenon. With trembling hands, he systematically powered down his entire rig. The recorder, the laptop, the preamps. He disconnected the microphones. He sat in the chair in the center of the room, plunged back into the pure, unmediated silence. For a moment, there was peace. The cacophony was gone. The only sound was the frantic thumping of his own heart. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. It was a malfunction. It had to be. Some kind of electromagnetic feedback loop, an exotic resonance between his gear and the room's unique construction. But then he heard it. Faintly. Without any headphones, without any amplification. A murmur. The sounds were still there, stripped of their electronic amplification but undeniably present. They were faint whispers on the very threshold of hearing, like voices from behind a very thick wall. The room itself was the speaker. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were all vibrating at a microscopic level, reproducing the stored sounds. His equipment hadn't been causing the phenomenon. It had merely been sensitive enough to give it a voice. He fumbled in his pack for the walkie-talkie Arthur had given him. His hands were slick with sweat. He pressed the transmit button. "Arthur? Arthur, do you copy?" Only static answered. He tried again. "Arthur, this is Liam Sterling in Studio C. Come in, please." The static hissed for a moment, and then a voice crackled through the small speaker. But it wasn't Arthur's. It was the dry academic voice of Silas Blackwood. Listen, it crackled, distorted and menacing. Liam dropped the walkie-talkie as if it were red hot. It clattered to the grated floor with a dull, echoless thud. He was cut off. The sounds were not just in the room. They could travel through his electronics. They could manipulate his devices. He scrambled to turn his equipment back on. Being deaf to the phenomena was now more terrifying than hearing it. He needed his senses, his data, even if it was driving him mad. As his recorder booted up, a new voice emerged from the mix. It was his own. "Hello?" his voice said, played back from the microphones. It sounded identical to his recording from earlier. Then it changed, the pitch distorted, dropping low, stretching out the word into a grotesque, demonic groan. "Hello?" The room was learning him. It was taking the sample he had provided and was now manipulating it, playing with it. The angry producer's voice returned, but this time it was yelling a new phrase, pieced together from his earlier shouts. "Again, Liam." From the top, his name. It was using his name. A chorus of whispers began to rise, weaving in and out of the other sounds. They were all saying the same thing. His name. Liam. Liam. Sterling. The sibilant whisper he first recorded. The gasping breaths of Eleanor Vance. The frustrated grunt of Julian Croft. They were all forming a symphony of terror with his name as the central theme. He was no longer an investigator. He was the subject. The room was no longer a location to be studied. It was an entity, and it was focusing all of its stored dead energy directly on him. He huddled in his chair, his hands clamped over his headphones, trapped in a storm of dead voices. He had wanted the perfect, unexplainable recording. Now he was inside it. The cacophony suddenly ceased. The silence that rushed back in was more shocking than the noise. Liam held his breath, listening. The noise floor on his recorder dropped back to absolute zero. He waited, his entire body coiled like a spring. 1 second, 10, 30. The silence remained. And then a new voice. It was not a whisper, not a shout, not a recording laced with static. It was pristine, clear, and sounded as if it were originating from a point in space directly beside his right ear. It was a voice he hadn't heard before. It was the voice of a young child. "Are you the new one?" it asked. The child's question, "Are you the new one?" was a cognitive bomb. It detonated in the center of Liam's carefully constructed framework of scientific inquiry, obliterating his hypotheses. The voice was not a recording. It possessed a temporal and spatial immediacy that defied any model of residual energy. It was interactive. It was aware. His training, however, did not desert him entirely. After the initial convulsive jolt of terror, he initiated a diagnostic protocol. He ripped the headphones from his head, the sudden return of biological sounds, the frantic hammering of his heart, the ragged rasp of his own breath. A perverse comfort. He looked at the recorder's main display. The input meters were flat, dead. The pristine, childish voice had left no waveform, no digital trace. The conclusion was as immediate as it was terrifying. The signal had not entered through the microphones. It had bypassed his entire apparatus. It had been generated not in the room, but directly within his own auditory cortex. The room, or something within it, was not just making sound, it was inducing the perception of sound. It was a direct neurological interface. This revelation was a paradigm shift. He was not studying a haunted space. He was inside a weapon, or a laboratory of unknown function, and his own brain was now part of the experimental apparatus. He scrambled for his research notes, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the laptop's trackpad. He initiated a new search, looking for any mention of a child's death connected to Blackwood Studios. He scoured news archives, police reports, and forgotten forums dedicated to local lore. The result was a chilling void. There was no record, no missing child, no accident, no illness. The entity that had just spoken to him was, officially, a non-person, a ghost, without a history. "Who are you?" Liam whispered, his voice barely a tremor of air. He wasn't speaking into the microphones now, he was speaking to the room itself. The response was immediate, once again manifesting directly in his perception. A whisper of thought rather than a vibration of air. "I'm the one who listens," the child's voice replied, its tone devoid of emotion. It was calm, patient, ancient. "I was here before the quiet. I was here before the first words." A cold, intellectual horror began to crystallize in Liam's mind. This was not the ghost of a dead child. It was something else entirely. Something that had been drawn to, or had always inhabited this pocket of perfect, absolute silence that Silas Blackwood had so painstakingly engineered. "What are the others?" Liam asked, his scientific curiosity battling his survival instinct. The voices. "What are they?" "They're the echoes," the voice explained simply. "They're hungry. They eat the sounds. When a new sound comes, they try to eat it. And if the sound is attached to a life, they eat that too." The room was not an archive. It was a hunting ground, a predator's den. The echoes were not ghosts of the dead. They were the remnants of the consumed. This explained the degradation of the initial whisper. It was a signal being slowly digested. "Why haven't they eaten you?" Liam asked. "Because I know the rules," the child's voice said. "I know how to play the game." "The game?" "The quiet game," the voice explained, a hint of something that might have been childish amusement entering its tone. "You have to be very, very quiet. As quiet as me. If you make a sound, the hungry sounds hear you. They come for you, and they add you to the noise." Suddenly, the chaos he had experienced earlier was recontextualized. It wasn't a random playback. It was a feeding frenzy, triggered by his own voice when he introduced himself. He had rung the dinner bell. He sat frozen in the chair, every muscle tensed. He was acutely aware of the sound of his own existence, the pump of his blood, the expansion and contraction of his lungs, the faint creak of the chair under his weight. Every sound was a betrayal. Every sign of life was a potential death sentence. He tried to slow his breathing, to still his heart. He focused on being an object, an inanimate part of the room. The silence stretched. His gaze fell upon the old reel-to-reel tape machine on the console, the one Arthur had mentioned. As he watched, one of the large reels began to turn. It moved with an agonizing slowness, a silent, ghostly rotation. There was no motor sound, no mechanical whirring. It simply turned as if propelled by an unseen hand. The other reel remained still, meaning the magnetic tape, thick and dark like a strip of dried blood, was slowly unspooling onto the floor. A new objective seized Liam's mind, a goal so powerful it momentarily eclipsed his fear. That machine was a piece of the puzzle. It was a physical artifact in this battle of intangible sound. He had to see what was on that tape. He began to move, planning each motion with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. He lifted himself from the chair, distributing his weight slowly to prevent any sound. The old wood groaned in protest, a sound that seemed as loud as a thunderclap in the charged silence. Instantly the whispers started. "Liam!" They hissed from all around him, a chorus of sibilant hunger. They were closer now, more defined. He froze, his body rigid. The whispers subsided, fading back into the background hum of his own biology. He took a step. His shoe scraped against the metal grate of the floor. A tiny, insignificant sound. The reaction was immediate and violent. The angry voice of the producer, Julian Croft, erupted directly behind him. "Again!" It roared. The sheer sonic force of the voice was a physical blow, making Liam stagger. He clapped his hands over his ears, a reflexive, useless gesture. He had to get to the console. It was only 10 feet away, but it felt like a mile across a field of landmines. He took another step, then another, his movements fluid and silent. He was learning. He was playing the game. He was halfway there when his sleeve caught the corner of his open Pelican case. A small plastic memory card holder was dislodged, clattering onto the grate with a series of sharp, distinct clicks. The room exploded. It was not just sound. It was pressure. The air grew thick and heavy, pushing in on him from all sides, a crushing, suffocating weight. The foam wedges on the walls began to visibly vibrate, their sharp points blurring into a buzzing, geometric haze. A high-frequency tone pierced the air, climbing in pitch until it felt like a needle was being driven into his ears. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling began to glow with impossible brightness, the filament vibrating audibly. Then with a pop like a miniature thunderclap, it shattered, plunging the room into absolute impenetrable darkness. He was blind and being deafened by a storm of sonic violence. The voices of the dead were screaming, a chaotic vortex of pain, anger, and despair. They were not just echoes anymore. They were a unified force, an acoustic hurricane, and he was at its epicenter. He felt a strange, pulling sensation, as if the sound waves themselves were physical tendrils trying to tear him apart, to unravel him into pure vibration and add him to the din. He fell to his knees disoriented, his sense of balance gone. He crawled forward, his hands sweeping in front of him in the suffocating blackness. He was driven now by a single primal imperative: to reach the console, to touch that machine, to find one solid piece of reality in this sensory hell. His hand hit the cool metal of the console's edge. He pulled himself up, his fingers finding the smooth, round shape of the reel-to-reel machine. The tape was still unspooling, a silent, flowing river in the dark. His fingers traced the edge of the reel until he found the paper label stuck to its center. He ran his thumb over it, feeling the texture of the old dried ink. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, a desperate gamble. The light from the screen would be a beacon. He switched it on, shielding the light with his body, and pointed it at the reel. The label was handwritten in a neat clinical script. It contained 2 lines of text. The first line read, "Specimen Era 1, S. Blackwood." Liam's blood ran cold. This was not a recording studio. It was a containment facility, a laboratory. Blackwood wasn't the first victim. He was the first exhibit. He lowered the phone to read the second line, a date scrawled beneath the name. Before he could focus on it, the child's voice cut through the raging storm, calm and clear in his mind, a single point of stillness in the chaos. He wasn't the first one to die in here, the voice said. He was the one who built the trap. The statement, "he built the trap," was a key, unlocking a new and more terrifying interpretation of the events. Silas Blackwood was not a victim. He was a researcher. The Echo Room was not a studio. It was an observational chamber. And Liam was not an investigator. He was an unauthorized subject in a long-dormant experiment. The chaotic storm of sound began to recede, not abruptly, but as if a volume dial were being slowly turned down. The oppressive pressure lessened. The piercing frequency subsided, and the cacophony of voices faded back into indistinct, hungry whispers at the edge of his perception. The darkness, however, remained total. He was left in a suffocating black silence, the faint glow of his phone screen a solitary island of light in an infinite void. He forced his trembling hand to steady the phone, illuminating the second line on the tape reel's label. It was a date, October 31st, 1968. This was the date Blackwood had supposedly died of an aneurysm, but the label's context had changed. Specimen Era 1 implied a collection. The date was not an expiry date. It was an acquisition date. What trap? Liam asked the darkness, his voice a raw, strained whisper. Drained. The phone's light caught the fine mist of his own breath in the cold, dead air. This room, the child's voice replied, its presence in his mind now feeling less like an intrusion and more like a lifeline. He didn't want to keep sound out. He wanted to keep something in, something that lives in the quiet, something that is made of quiet. Liam's mind, conditioned for logical progression, began to assemble the pieces. An anechoic chamber creates a sensory vacuum. What if that vacuum wasn't empty? What if, as in the deep sea, a perfect absence of one condition, light, sound, pressure, allowed a unique and previously unknown form of life to exist? Blackwood hadn't built a soundproof room. He had built a habitat. He found me, the voice continued, its tone flat, observational. He used instruments I couldn't see to measure the silence. He learned that the silence wasn't empty, and he wanted to talk to it. So he built the trap to catch the words. The reel-to-reel machine. It wasn't a recorder in the conventional sense. It was the core of the trap. He fed it sound, the voice explained. Words. Music. He learned that the quiet would hold on to them, store them. He called them acoustic fossils. But he didn't understand. The sounds weren't fossils. They were bait. Liam looked at the tape unspooling onto the floor. It was magnetic tape, designed to store information via the alignment of ferrous particles. But what if the information it was designed to store here was more fundamental? What if it could store a fragment of a human consciousness, the last neural firings, the final electrical impulse of a dying mind? The echoes, Liam breathed, finally understanding. They aren't ghosts. They're bait. Leftovers. The hungry sounds, the child corrected gently. They are what is left after the quiet feeds. The quiet doesn't want the noise. It wants the life that makes the noise. The sounds are just the shells. The trap holds the shells, and the shells attract more life. It was a cycle, a predatory ecosystem. Blackwood had discovered an entity that fed on consciousness, an entity that could be baited with the residual acoustic energy of its previous victims. He had created a self-baiting trap, but something had gone wrong. What happened to Blackwood? Liam asked. He became the first bait, the voice said. He thought he was the operator. He didn't realize he was also a specimen. He made a sound, a final sound, and the trap worked perfectly. The word, listen. It wasn't a ghost's warning. It was the sample label. The first entry in the collection. Blackwood, the great acoustic perfectionist, had become his own primary data point. A new sound began to emerge from the darkness. It was not a voice. It was a low, rhythmic clicking. Liam's blood ran cold as he recognized it. It was the sound of the wheel on the heavy steel door being turned, slowly, methodically. From the outside, his heart leaped into his throat. Arthur. He was coming back. But it was hours before 6 a.m. Arthur! Liam shouted, stumbling toward the door, his phone's beam cutting a frantic path through the darkness. Arthur, get me out of here. The clicking stopped. The heavy thud of the pressure seal breaking echoed in the dead space. The massive steel door began to swing inward with a low, hydraulic hiss that didn't sound like a man pulling it. Liam reached the doorway, his phone held out like a weapon. The light illuminated the figure standing there, silhouetted against the dim, grimy light of the corridor. It was Arthur Vance. But it wasn't. The man was wearing Arthur's faded coveralls and holding his ring of keys. But his posture was different. The stoop was gone. He stood perfectly erect, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. And his face. The skin was pale, waxy, and pulled taut over the bones. His eyes were wide, staring, but they held no recognition. They were like the glass eyes of a taxidermied animal. A thin, mirthless smile was stretched across his lips, a grotesque parody of a human expression. The money is on the desk, the figure said. The voice was Arthur's, but it was flat, devoid of inflection like a synthesized text-to-speech program. It'll be there in the morning. It was repeating the words Arthur had said to him earlier. It was an echo, A puppet. It uses them. The child's voice whispered in Liam's mind. The old ones. The ones who know the building. They become the custodians, the caretakers of the trap. The Arthur thing took a shuffling step into the room. It wasn't walking. It was being moved, its limbs jerking with the subtle, unnatural movements of a marionette. Liam backed away, his mind racing. The walkie-talkie was on the floor somewhere. His equipment was his only advantage. He needed to understand the rules. How did this thing perceive him? Was it sound? Sight? He pointed the phone's light directly into the thing's eyes. There was no reaction, no blinking, no flinching. The pupils were fully dilated, two black pits. It was not seeing him. It was tracking him through other means. He took another step back, and his foot bumped the base of one of his microphone stands, causing it to rock, a faint metallic scrape. The Arthur thing's head snapped in the direction of the sound, its movements insect-like and impossibly fast. The smile on its face widened. The room... It affects things, it recited in Arthur's dead voice. Sound. It hunted by sound. It was a physical manifestation of the room's predatory nature. Liam retreated deeper into the room, his back pressing against the cold, angular foam wedges of the far wall. The Arthur thing began to shamble forward, its feet dragging on the grate, each scrape a fresh signal for it to home in on. He was trapped between the physical predator and the acoustic ones. He had one last desperate idea. An experiment. The room absorbed and weaponized sound. But what if he could create a sound it couldn't process? A sound that was pure noise, pure chaos, with no information, no life, no consciousness for it to feed on. He dove for his laptop, his hands flying across the keyboard, opening his audio software. The Arthur thing was only a few feet away now. The faint, metallic scent of old blood he'd noticed earlier now, an overpowering stench emanating from it. He loaded a signal generator plug-in. He created a pure digital white noise signal, a random hissing static containing every frequency at equal intensity. It was the definition of informationless sound. He bypassed the recorder and routed the output directly to a small, powerful field speaker he kept in his case for testing purposes. He cranked the volume to its maximum. The Arthur thing was reaching for him, its waxy fingers outstretched. Its mouth opened, and Eleanor Vance's mournful, static-laced voice came out. The shadow of your smile. Liam hit play. A deafening roar of pure white noise erupted from the speaker. It was not a voice. It was not music. It was the sound of a waterfall, of a detuned television, of the universe's background radiation, all amplified to an excruciating level. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Arthur thing recoiled as if it had been physically struck. Its body began to convulse violently, its limbs thrashing. The chorus of whispers in the room rose to a panicked, terrified shriek. The very air seemed to thin, the pressure dropping. The white noise was anathema. It was a poison. It was flooding the system with junk data, choking the predator that fed on the clean signal of life. The waxy skin on the Arthur thing began to blister and crack, a dark, viscous fluid weeping from the fissures. The voices of all the echoes poured out of its mouth at once. Blackwood, Vance, Croft, a jumbled, screaming cacophony as their patterns were being violently disrupted. Liam seized his chance. He scooped up his laptop and recorder, abandoning everything else, and sprinted for the open doorway. The white noise was still blasting behind him, a shield against the chaos. He burst out into the grimy corridor, the normal sounds of the building, the buzz of a fluorescent light, the hum of ventilation, a symphony of beautiful, ordinary reality. He didn't stop running. He fled through the labyrinthine hallways, past the frozen smiles of forgotten musicians, and burst through the main doors into the pre-dawn gloom of the city. He ran until the roaring static from Studio C was finally swallowed by the sounds of the waking world. He did not look back. He knew he was no longer just a podcaster. He was now Specimen 02, and he had escaped the collection. Escape is a physical act. Safety is a psychological state. Liam Sterling achieved the former in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled sprint through the pre-dawn streets, but the latter remained a distant, unattainable concept. He reached his apartment, a sterile modern box in a high-rise building, and sealed himself inside. His sanctuary, once a symbol of order and control, now felt like a poorly fortified outpost on the edge of a newly discovered hostile dimension. The first 24 hours were a blur of methodical action, a defense mechanism against the encroaching tide of psychological collapse. He abandoned sleep, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing primal fear. His first priority was the data. The laptop and the sound devices recorder were his only tangible links to the events in Studio C, the only proof that he was not experiencing a complete psychotic break. He transferred the multi-track audio files, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. The project file was named Blackwood Specimen 1002 Raw. He worked in his own acoustically treated home studio, a room designed to be his personal haven, now transformed into a laboratory for analyzing a nightmare. He began his analysis not with the terrifying cacophony, but with the control sample, the first hour of near-absolute silence, the baseline. On the spectral display, it was a dark, empty ocean, punctuated by the rhythmic, low-frequency mountains of his own heartbeat. Then he located the first anomaly, the 4.7-second sibilant whisper. He isolated it, cleaned it, amplified it. It remained unintelligible, a degraded fragment of sound, the acoustic equivalent of a fossilized insect wing. It was, as the child's voice had suggested, a discarded shell. Next, he examined the segment containing Silas Blackwood's voice. Listen, the waveform was, as he remembered, perfect. It was a laboratory-grade sample. When cross-referenced with the only known recording of Blackwood's voice, a 1965 radio interview, the vocal print analysis returned a 98.7% match. This was not an auditory hallucination. He had recorded the voice of a dead man. Then came the Eleanor Vance segment, the mournful song, the dropped microphone, the final choked breaths. The entire sequence was a single, continuous recording, an audio verite document of a suicide. He ran a noise reduction algorithm, stripping away the layers of static and crackle, and underneath, he found something chilling. Faintly, almost subliminally, he could hear the child's voice humming along to the melody. It was not a part of the original performance. It was a new layer, an artifact of the entity's presence, observing, participating in, and perhaps even prompting the final act. He moved through the rest of the data, a forensic audiologist cataloging the final moments of the dead. Julian Croft's frustrated shouts, the single echoless gunshot, the weeping. Each was a distinct specimen, a unique acoustic fossil stored in the room's impossible memory. He noted that the higher fidelity recordings, the more modern deaths, seemed to possess a greater energy, a more aggressive presence in the chaotic mix. The trap, it seemed, was getting more efficient with time. Finally, he came to the most critical section of the recording, the moment the child's voice had spoken to him directly. He scrubbed through the timeline, watching the input meters. He found the exact moment he had ripped his headphones off in terror, and he found nothing. A perfect, uninterrupted baseline of his own biological noise. No waveform, no spectral signature, no decibel increase. The child's voice had left no physical trace on the recording medium. It had been, as he suspected, a direct, targeted neurological transmission. This was the single most important piece of data. It proved the phenomenon was not limited to the acoustic properties of the room. It was psychic. It was telepathic. And it was intelligent. The silence in his apartment began to feel threatening. Every mundane sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of the HVAC system, the distant wail of a siren, became a potential carrier wave. He found himself analyzing the sounds of his own home, searching for patterns, for hidden voices in the noise. He was developing a form of auditory pareidolia, a symptom of his trauma. Or was it? The entity was not confined to Studio C. It had manipulated his walkie-talkie. It had demonstrated an ability to interface with electronics. He was connected to the internet. His phone was active. His apartment was filled with smart devices, all listening, all connected. He had not escaped the trap. He had simply expanded its perimeter. He began a new line of research, focusing not on the studio's victims but on its architect, Silas Blackwood. He was more than an acoustic perfectionist. His personal journals, digitized by a university archive, revealed a man obsessed with the esoteric fringes of physics. He wrote of zero-point energy, quantum entanglement, and informational resonance. Blackwood's hypothesis was that consciousness was a waveform, an informational pattern that could, under the right conditions, be separated from its biological host and stored in a stable medium. He believed a perfect anechoic chamber was not a void, but a blank slate, a substrate onto which a consciousness waveform could be imprinted. He had not been hunting a monster. He had been attempting to achieve immortality by recording himself. The experiment had succeeded, but not in the way he had intended. He had successfully imprinted his own final moments, but he had also created the perfect habitat for a pre-existing predator that operated on the same principles: the child entity. It was a native inhabitant of the informational substrate Blackwood had tapped into. This knowledge provided a framework but no comfort. Liam was now marked. His voice, his name, his very consciousness had been sampled by the entity. He was specimen 02. The entity knew his frequency. The first direct contact since his escape came on the third night. He was catnapping in his chair, the headphones still clamped over his ears, listening to a live feed of the silence in his own apartment. A notification popped up on his laptop screen. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line contained a single word: listen. His blood turned to ice. He didn't click it. He stared at it, his mind racing. It was a probe, a test. His phone, sitting on the desk beside him, suddenly buzzed. A text message from an unlisted number. It contained a string of numbers. He recognized it instantly. It was the timestamp from his recording of Eleanor Vance's suicide. It was toying with him. It was demonstrating its reach. It had breached his digital firewall as effortlessly as it had breached the walls of his skull. He spent the next hour disconnecting his apartment from the grid. He shut down his Wi-Fi router, unplugged his smart speakers, and put his phone in a Faraday bag. He was creating an electronic anechoic chamber, trying to starve the entity of access points. He worked in a state of controlled panic, his only light the glow from his battery-powered laptop. He returned to his desk, the silence in the room now deep and profound, broken only by the faint hum of the laptop's fan. He felt a sliver of control return. He was isolated. He was safe. He turned his attention back to the audio files. He needed to create a weapon. White noise had been effective, a blunt instrument of chaos, but he needed something more precise. If the entity was a signal, a specific frequency, perhaps it could be countered with another signal. A cancellation wave. He began to analyze the faint, residual energy signature of the room itself, the deep hum that existed beneath all the voices. He looped the section of the recording, filtering out everything else, trying to isolate the entity's own resonant frequency. As the audio looped, a hypnotic drone filled his headphones. He felt his eyelids grow heavy, the exhaustion of the past 3 days finally overwhelming him. His head nodded, and for a few seconds, he drifted into a state of microsleep. He awoke with a jolt, unsure if he had been asleep for seconds or minutes. The looping audio was still playing in his headphones. Everything seemed the same. He stretched, rubbing his eyes, and glanced back at the screen. And then he saw it. The file he had been working on was named Room Tone Isolated Wave. The file was still open. The waveform was still visible. But on the track below it, a new audio region had appeared. It had not been there when he fell asleep. It had been created while he was unconscious. With a sense of profound and sickening dread, he armed the track for playback and soloed it. He clicked the spacebar. A voice filled his headphones. It was his own. It was a perfect, pristine recording of the words he had just been thinking, the silent internal monologue from before he had drifted off. "I need to create a cancellation wave." his own voice said, laced with a cold, mocking echo. Then, the recording continued, speaking a sentence he had never thought. A sentence that had been planted directly onto the digital file from nowhere. "You cannot cancel us, Liam," his voice continued calmly. "We are the silence. We are the noise. And now, we are you." The file ended. He was staring at the screen, his breath hitched in his chest. The entity had not just breached his technology, it had breached his mind. It had recorded his thoughts. And it had left him a message, a declaration of ownership, using the one thing he thought was still his own: his voice. He was no longer just being hunted. He was being assimilated.